I'm going to call the member for Hasluck.
Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to be speaking in front of you today in particular. I noted the comments for the member for Fairfax and I found the logic of some of the points he made very fascinating, given that he's a significant champion of deregulation in the industry sector and for having a voice from the sector influence government. It is no different in this instance where universities are saying to us, we as an industry want change and reform that will enable us to provide the programs, courses and opportunities for young Australians. The member for Charlton, it's always interesting when we make reference to comparative studies of other countries, because when we do comparatives of other countries, we also have to consider what were the variables that came into play that we don't talk about in this chamber. Because any comparative study can be flawed in the way in which it is undertaken and where the comparisons are. I don't disagree with your argument that maybe Newcastle will be affected, but there is nothing wrong with people having choices to cherry-pick and be cherry-picked for courses at universities that give them the optimum pathway to a career. And that's what I see the legislation doing. And I do support the Higher Education Research and Reform Bill of 2014 because I do, having had experience as a Pro-Chancellor of a university, saw the way in which the regulatory framework and the legislation inhibit us from creating niche concepts and constructs within the university. And if I could take that experience from then to now, I know that I would have relished the changes that are proposed in this bill. This is the second time I've spoken in support of the higher education reforms in this chamber, and I'm pleased that higher education is being so vigorously debated, and I'm pleased that both houses of the parliament have been working at getting this package right. And I would ask that those who are opposed at the moment give serious consideration to the voice of the industry who's asking for this reform, who see that there is a need for it. We shouldn't be blockers. It doesn't matter whether it's an opposition or crossbenchers. Open your minds and think about what it is the industry is asking for. Because I have seen time and time again within this chamber where members on both sides have stood up and argued that the industry representation has to be considered in respect to the bill that we are debating at the time. And this is no different, because if an industry is calling for it, then let's enable the legislation to enact that for it to occur. I'm not impressed with the misrepresentations of those opposite. We need to ensure a strong and vibrant education sector which prepares students for their future career pathways. Deputy Speaker, we can't delude ourselves into thinking that the current higher education system is meeting those needs. And Deputy Speaker, in my electorate of Hasluck, on average 30 minutes from Perth City, only 1 in 6 young people takes up higher education. For me, that's far too low. And meanwhile, 1 in 10 young people in my electorate of Hasluck are counted among Australia's unemployed. That's too high. At the moment, Australia's higher education system is not working as well as it could. And this gives us an opportunity to enable them to do that. The whole construct of scholarships that will, and I won't cite the figures because I've heard them in many of the members' speeches, but it creates an opportunity in a way that doesn't exist at the moment. And there are many in this chamber who did receive free education, but that was at a time when a government made that decision. But a person who I call and regard as a good friend, and I admire and respect him, John Dawkins, as the Minister for Education, realised that it was not sustainable, that there was a need to have people pay their way. And he introduced a system in which all of us, in our other degrees that we undertook, contributed to our higher education. And it's also interesting when you have Maxine McHugh also calling for this passage of the bill through both houses. Belinda Robinson has made very strong cases. And so our higher education system could be much more accessible to young people. Our higher education system is a crucial step which leads to jobs for more young people by equipping them with the skills they need for the future. Deputy Speaker, when we're in government, if something is not working, we have to do something about it. And if the industry tells us it's not working and they want reform, then let's encourage it, let's support them. The reforms will do something about higher education and improve on the status quo. I admit that we have a great university system, it's served us well, but we're moving into a contemporary global period in which Australia has to be highly competitive. And we need to encourage as many young people as possible to take those pathways, although not everybody wants a university course, and I acknowledge that because there are many who want to do apprenticeships and trades, etc. The reforms will do something about higher education and improve on the status quo, as I've said. We have overwhelming evidence that change is needed, and I would encourage the opposition to get on board for the common sense and for the common good of our country. The reforms would allow more young people in my electorate, for example, of Hasluck, to access higher education. The reforms would see more young people in my electorate qualify for Commonwealth support for their higher education. It is estimated that an additional 80,000 students will get this support for bachelor degrees, certificates 2, 3 or 4, diplomas and advanced diplomas. What a great way of encouraging young people into pathways. This is an important point for my electorate and the electorate of all members in this chamber. For the first time, the government would be supporting students undertaking a wider range of degree types. This includes associate degrees and diploma courses that provide them the knowledge and skills they can directly apply to jobs. Diploma courses provide important pathways for less prepared students, giving them the opportunity to develop the skills needed for further study. I am pleased we can lower fees for young people to encourage them to undertake these courses and give them the best chance of success in any future pathway that they choose. They also mean that young people won't have to pay the unfair loan fees that they currently do. This in turn will mean that they won't pay the higher interest rates if they are caring for young children and are earning below the minimum repayment threshold, and that's an important point in the reforms. For the young people who need it, these reforms would ensure their access to the largest Commonwealth scholarships scheme ever. The reforms would also offer free education to the brightest students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And in my own electorate, in my own life experiences, I've seen so many people in lower socioeconomic background contexts that never have the opportunity to go beyond their secondary schooling. And if we are in a position as a Commonwealth to encourage the opportunities for them under the new reforms, then we should take that step and enable that to occur. The young people in Hasluck are not studying for the sake of studying. They're studying so they can get a job, and I'm confident that the proposed changes are focused on their needs. They'll be able to access more information about the quality of courses and the institutions they are considering. Young people and their families will be able to log on to websites that give them access to the information about what students and employers think of the courses they're considering. Because there's no sense in doing a course that's not going to lead to a job and where there is not a market for those occupations. They'll be able to find out how successful previous graduates have been at finding jobs. Once they're enrolled in a course of study at TAFE or uni, these reforms will mean that students with a low socioeconomic status won't be left to battle it out alone. These reforms will increase their access to tailored support, including assistance to help with the cost of living, tutorial support and assistance at other critical points in their study. And I currently see that with a niece of mine who is studying at UWA, that the levels of support and interaction have been tremendous, but if we could make that universally available to any Australian student, then it augurs well for our country. Higher education institutions will exercise the right to set fees in a competitive market. Higher education institutions have shown that they can be relied on to act responsibly in doing so. Our universities believe that without these reforms, our $15 billion education services industry would be at risk. As I told this chamber in September last year, we cannot equip these young people for tomorrow using practices of yesterday. There has been a debate for many years on how to reform the higher education system, and again, John Dawkins and others that have followed have certainly attempted to make significant reforms for the betterment of our society. This is an almost universal commitment to the what, and we're here to settle the how. Finally, after 33 reviews of higher education system, there is almost universal commitment by universities and their governing bodies to the government's reforms. We have the opportunity in this session to fix Australia's higher education system and to future-proof it for our young people. That's the story I want to take back to the electorate of Hasluck. I want to tell the 40 students from Lumen Christi College in Martin who are among the 80% at their school to achieve the results they need to get in their first preference to the university course. And I want to tell the same students from the government schools within my electorate. I want them to benefit from a higher education experience that they've worked for. I want these students to enter a higher education system that is working for them and is flexible enough to adapt to the world in which they live. But the thing that struck me in this debate was two experiences. One, when I was in the United Arab Emirates, I went to University World. And at University World, when they took us through, I was fascinated at the number of universities that had established campuses in the UAE. And it was to facilitate flexible study arrangements that would allow students from anywhere in the world to go and study. I could walk from the campus established by Harvard to an Australian university campus established in University World, and what I got was the best of what was available. And it gave me something in the way of an idea and concept for the reforms that we need in this country, because it is flexibility and choice that is important. And in the ASEAN delegation, when I visited Malaysia, Brunei and the Philippines, we had discussions around the flexibility of universities, the opportunities that would prevail for not only Asian students coming to Australia, but for those countries to consider that with such flexible approaches with Australian universities, they were also keen to have relationships and possibly become a hub to ensure that higher education was available to any Asian student from any country in that region to study, to have choices. And they talked about the historical connection to the United Kingdom. And in those discussions, the Australian members of the delegation suggested that Australia should be a principal point of call because our universities were moving towards the top 100. We were ambitious as a government to ensure that reforms that would take place would make our universities equivalent. The other element I think that we have to factor into giving our universities the opportunity to enable to undertake reforms is the competition that they may have in the future from online education, from universities who are prepared to provide courses to Australian students online, not requiring them to go overseas. Technology has improved substantially, and I see it in Australia now where students don't front classes, they can do them from their lounge room. They do their assignments, they submit them back, they participate in the chat rooms. And it won't be long before our universities face the threat of Harvard's, Oxford and some of the world leading universities, including from China, offering courses here to the detriment of our higher education sector. So I would encourage the opposition and crossbenchers to give serious consideration to this bill and to consider not the context of today and some of the arguments that I've heard, but to think about a future in which we future-proof the opportunities for our students and for those who wish to undertake university studies. Because that should be paramount in our thinking when this bill goes back to the Senate, because we have an obligation to be leaders and to make the reforms that an industry is asking for, to support the request for those reforms and allow our universities to operate in a way that gives them the greater flexibility and increases the opportunity for the number of our students wishing to seek study courses that will lead to jobs not only in our own states and territories or in Australia, but to be competitive anywhere within the world. And I certainly support the higher education bill. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.